Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the greatest games on the Blizzard. My name is Marcus Speller. With me, of course, is Jonathan Wilson. And with us in the pod today is Harry Pearson, journalist and author, specialising in sport, a contributor to When Saturday Comes, among many others, and an author of a number of books, including The Far Corner, A Mazy Dribble Through Northeast Football, and Connie, The Marvellous Life of Leary Constantine, and most recently, The Farther Corner, A Sentimental Return to Northeast Football. Harry, welcome to the pod.
Good afternoon.
Now, today, everybody, we go back to the 11th of June, 1998, to the World Cup in France. The opening match of Group B that finished Italy 2, Chile 2. Harry, why have you chosen this game?
Well, it was the 1998 World Cup was I was going to say it was the first tournament that I ever went to. It was actually it was the only World Cup I've ever been to, and I had an Interrail card, and I went to see 16 games in 19 days in 8 different cities.
Blimey!
It was like my it was like my gap year, except I was 37, and it was just the most fantastic time of my life. Watching football every day, hanging around with journalists, going out for great dinners. And it's France in the summer, so what was not to like about it. So when I looked at the games, I got my accreditation. It was the first time that When Saturday Comes were ever offered accreditation for a tournament. And so I remember them phoning me up and saying, would you be prepared to go to the World Cup for us? So I had to sort of think for like 2 minutes before answering. But because it was When Saturday Comes, a monthly magazine, we were a bit wary of getting, because obviously you get the accreditation, but then you've got to get into the games. You've got to get tickets that actually get you into the games, and they're allocated in certain ways. And monthly magazines are fairly low down. So I picked out a lot of fairly obscure games to go to. And if I look through the list, some of the games I can't remember at all what even happened at them. If it's news to me, I was at Colombia versus Tunisia in Montpellier, which is just news to me. I only know because I've got it down on a list that I wrote. I have no idea how that game ended. And of the games that I went to, probably the most momentous and probably still the most extraordinary game I've ever been to was the United States against Iran in Lyon. But that game was amazing for what was going on off the field rather than what was going on it. And though, I'm sure we'd like to spend 45 minutes discussing geopolitics, I know even less about that than I do about football.
It's happened before, Harry. Don't worry.
It has.
Hang on. Breaking news. Colombia beat Tunisia 1-0 with an 82nd minute goal from Preciado.
Did they? A fantastic news. Well, that's good. I'm trying hard now. I can't even picture it. So there were lots of other games that I have sort of fond memories of. I went to Argentina versus Japan, which was Japan's first game in the World Cups, and they're photographers. In those days, they still had the photograph booths where the photographers had to bring their film up and have it developed in these photo booths. And the Japanese took so many photos that they literally, you could see them at half-time running towards these Fuji photo booths. They practically knocked them over. They hit them at such speed. So I sort of remember that. And then I was at the South Korea-Mexico game when Blanco did the bunny hop.
Oh, yeah.
So I remember that. But then Italy versus Chile, that was, of the games, that was actually the best football game with the best players. And also, it was the first time that I ever did a match report for a national newspaper. Having been told, when I was, because I worked for The Guardian as well as When Saturday Comes, and I was doing kind of column and colour pieces for them. And so I said I was going to the World Cup and if they'd like me to do something for them while I was there. So I went to the meeting, the pre-World Cup meeting in the offices, and Mike Averis, the sports editor, said to me, it's really great, we'd love to use your stuff, but obviously we won't need you to do any match reports because that's not the sort of thing you do. Obviously meaning we don't regard you as competent to do that because you're not actually a journalist. And then, so I sort of took this, I thought, oh, great, because I didn't really... And then I was on the train, but the first game I went to was Morocco against Norway in Montpellier. And then I got on the train to Bordeaux from Montpellier, which is a long old haul. And then on the way, the phone rang, my big brick-like mobile phone rang. And it was Mike Averis, and he said, "Are you on the train to Bordeaux?" I said, yeah, I am, yeah. And he's, "Remember when I said to you about how we wouldn't use you to do match reports?" And I went, "Yeah, not really the kind of stuff I do." And he went, "Yeah, well, forget about that because David Lacey's dropped out. We need you to replace." So, like me replacing David Lacey was like if they brought me on to replace Cristiano Ronaldo in the Champions League final, isn't it? So that was what happened. But he said to me, actually, it was Paddy Agnew was there. So he said, Paddy's there, so he'll do the main report. We need you to do the second report. But he said Paddy's based in Italy, so he'll cover the Italian team, and we'd like you to write from the angle of the Chileans.
Well, back
So
in
he
those
said,
days,
do you
no
know
mean
anything
feat.
about? Do you know anything about the Chilean team? I said, well, I saw highlights of the game at Wembley in February. He went, well, there you are then. So that was it. So that was my knowledge, was a game that I'd seen 20 minutes of in February.
My goodness. Well, that was a lovely little memory walk down memory lane of France 98, yeah.
But I think there is a sort of more general point there about the shame. I mean, this is not the shame, but there's something has gone from tournaments these days. That, my first tournament, I did the Asian Cup in 2000, did the Cup of Nations in 2002, and then I did the Euros in 2004. What I remember about Euro 2004, because Portugal's a relatively small country with relatively good train lines, you could just get up in the morning in Lisbon and decide to go to a game. And you were throwing yourself slightly at the mercy of there being spare accreditations about, but basically you could just go wherever you wanted, and it was great. And everything's too big now. You just can't do that.
Well, I think the other thing at that tournament as well was the '98 World Cup was probably the last one. There weren't kind of fan zones or anything like that, so it was still, when you were on the train, there were fans from every different country you could imagine, on the train. So you sat and talked to them. So it was a really kind of
there was actually strangely there was a little bit of that in Russia. Russia was oddly the most I've known at a World Cup like that. I guess maybe a bit in Germany in 2006. But I think in Russia, because everybody was getting the train everywhere, there wasn't really another viable way to travel. You could fly, but the train was way cheaper. Russian trains are great. So there was a bit of that in Russia. For some reason, there were Peruvians everywhere in Russia. You could go in a restaurant in any city in Russia during the tournament, and there'd be a huge clutch of Peruvians there. And that is one of the beauties of the World Cup, is this sense of everybody
it was one
mixing.
of the great things. I think the other thing was in '98, it was sort of because it was pre-Google, so to find out anything about it, you had to actually talk to people. The only way to find out about Chile was to actually talk to some Chilean fans. But unfortunately, the only Chilean fan I found turned out to be a Belgian who didn't know anything about Chile. The only thing he could tell me about Chile was that the capital was Santiago, which I actually knew already.
Well, they had played twice before at World Cups.
They had indeed against Italy, famous games.
No, but
Italy.
These two had met previously at World Cups. Firstly, the Battle of Santiago, and then the Battle of Sunderland. Not that anybody called it that.
I was going to say that's the other reason that I've chosen this game, obviously, because they played at Roker Park,
which was the first World Cup game my dad ever went to. So
really, because they won that 2-0, didn't they?
They did.
Then the wheels came off.
Indeed,
the wheels came off in Middlesbrough, not for the first time.
Now I realise why you chose this game as opposed to any of the other ones you mentioned, because Jonathan needs his Sunderland mention in every podcast. It's stipulated in his contract. But that's a fair point, because this Chile in '98 World Cup was great, and it was just before, as you mentioned, sort of Google and internet, where you could find out a lot more about sort of some of these sort of more lesser known teams, should I say? So, how did you find out about
well, as
Chile,
I say,
other than talking to the Belgian?
I got on the bus, talked to the Belgian man, which was hopeless, and I got to the ground, and Simon Cooper was there from the Financial Times, who I knew did sort of know a lot about, sort of overseas football. So I sort of sidled at him, and I said, the Chilean team. I tried to ask him in a sort of way that he wouldn't realise that I was trying to get information out of him. So I said, the Chilean team, what do we know about them, sort of thing? And he said, well, Javier Margas, the centre-half, looks like Frankenstein's monster. And then he walked off. So I had two pieces of information I had were that Santiago was the capital and that Margas looked like Frankenstein's monster, which is not a lot to work on for 650 words.
I'd love to read this match report, by the way.
I've got it here. I can photograph it and send it to you. When I look through my notes, I was just looking through it because I've got my notebook as well, with all my notes in it for doing the match report. And one of the notes actually says, because I travelled up on the bus to the ground, and one of the notes just says, "Why are Italians so good looking? Surrounded by them on the bus, felt like an ostrich in a Raphael painting." So that didn't make it into the match report for some reason.
And presumably you haven't got to the bottom of that answer either.
No, I haven't.
Just one of those things that we have to go along with. Well, I mean, in Group B, it was obviously Italy and Chile, and also Austria and Cameroon. Chile playing in their first World Cup since 1982. The only time they'd been past the group stages was in 1962, of course, when they hosted the tournament, finishing third. They'd finished fourth in South American World Cup qualifying in a group, and they were behind Colombia, Paraguay and Argentina. Brazil obviously qualified automatically as champions from the previous World Cup. So we didn't know that much about them, Jonathan, but we did get an insight into how good they were, as Harry's already said, when they turned up to Wembley in February of that year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of those... The handful of friendlies actually mean something. That particularly the front two, Salas and Zamorano. And you look through the side; they're the two names that stand out. They were the two class players. But they really gave England a chasing, the two of them, that night. Was it 2-0? I finished or 2-1.
2-0.
It was 2-0, yeah.
And the famous Salas goal. The famous Salas goal when he sort of takes the ball on his thigh on the turn, volleys it into the edge of the box. It's a magnificent goal. But I look back at a couple of match reports from that game. And it's genuinely amazing the kind of the reaction to how well they played. That there was some slightly odd comparisons of Salas to Maradona, which I just don't think they're similar players in any way. But sort of saying kind of Chile teaching England a lesson. That, England have sort of got to wake up. That they might have had a good Euros 2 years earlier, but they're way behind the best in the world. And that meaning Chile, who'd just come fourth, brackets fifth. In South American qualifying. So, but I mean, I think essentially they were pretty solid with that front two. But that front two was an amazing front two. Salas, who I mean, arguably, I mean, would you say he's Rivers' best ever, or best post 1990 striker alongside Crespo, possibly? And Zamorano, who'd got 77 goals, I think, for Real Madrid.
He got a load of goals for Real Madrid.
Yeah, I think it's over 100 in total and 77 in La Liga. And they just work really well together. I mean, Zamorano was 5'10", Salas 5'9", so a medium-sized man combination. But both of them had that sort of great sort of explosive power that, they were both kind of good in the air for their height. They both had a great spring. They both had powerful shots. And Zamorano had been at Inter as well, where Roy Hodgson didn't fancy him at all, which I find really odd. Yeah, I dinner with Roy Hodgson, and the two things that came out of that dinner were he hates Parmesan cheese and he just does not rate even Zamorano. And we kept asking, we kept saying, kind of, Zamorano, 100 odd goals for Real Madrid. Couldn't play football. What do you mean he couldn't play football?
Well, Roy Hodgson actually pundited on this game. You can
he
find
did.
Sky Sports footage of him and the...
No doubt fuming at Zamorano being unable to play football.
Yeah, well, he's there with, I think it's Brian Robson, and they're being interviewed by the Right Honourable Richard Keys. And he, I think he changes his mind a bit. At the start, he was a bit like, I'm not really too sure about 1 and 2. And then he was a bit like, they've been absolutely fantastic. And I think, Harry, this was almost like a kind of a more modern day friendly. You think about some of the England games. I mean, the obvious one is that Hungary in the 50s, when they turn up and will absolutely tonk England. But this is, I suppose, a more sort of, I say modern day, it was in the late 90s, but a more sort of modern day version of that, if you see what I mean. A team turns up, nobody's really got any expectation. And England, going into the World Cup in France under Glenn Hoddle, actually with a bit of expectation and a very good squad of players. And Michael Owen's debut happened in that friendly, of course, against Chile. That was sadly overlooked. But it did have a feel of that, of hang on, this unknown quantity, my goodness, they're pretty handy.
Yeah, I think so. And I think also that England had that because they lost to Uruguay, didn't they? Was that before the 1990 World Cup? They seem to come up against South American teams quite rarely and then get found out by them. But I think the thing with Salas was that I think he'd been linked with them. He was obviously went to Lazio, but I think he was linked with Man United, and then Alex Ferguson sort of didn't really think, wasn't kind of sure about him. And then in that game, it was like he just sort of said, "There you go," Because Jonathan was saying about the comparison with Maradona, but the other player that he was compared with, which seems a better comparison, because he was sort of short and chunky. He was an unlikely looking footballer. He was quite podgy with a kind of double. He had a bit of a double chin, and the most likely person I would have thought was Gerd Muller. I mean, that's a flattering comparison because he wasn't as great a player as Gerd Muller, obviously, who was. But, that was the sort of player he was. He was very dynamic. He was quick, probably over about 4 or 5 yards, which is all you need to be fast over in football. And he had that. I think Zamorano was one of those players. I mean, it's interesting that Hodgson says that. You often wonder with people who really know a lot about football what they actually know about football. Is sort of strange because he was a player, as a fan, every time he got the ball you thought he was going to do something. He gave that impression to me, that when he got the ball you thought there was a sort of intention about his play to make something happen. So the idea that people would say, he wasn't a footballer, I find that quite
it sort of frustrated me that night because I was fascinated he should say that, but I couldn't actually pin him down on why he thought that. I mean, I look back, I think he only scored 7 goals in Serie A that season under Hodgson.
But 7 goals in Serie A is a lot of goals. It's not a bad return.
Yeah. So I don't know. But I mean, the two of them as a pairing were quite interesting as well, in that Zamorano was from a very impoverished background, being born in Santiago and moved up to the Atacama and sort of grew up in a village in the Atacama, playing barefoot on dusty streets. Whereas Salas was from Temuco, south of Santiago, and sort of middle class background. So they sort of brought together north and south, working class and almost sub working class and middle class.
Yeah, it was nice that it was a proper strike force. I mean, we'll talk about this in the second half, but both sides had 2 forwards who complemented each other quite nicely. Well, I tell you what, let's have a break, gentlemen, and then we'll talk about some of the more finer details and the match itself. So back in a moment, everybody. Welcome back to the Greatest Games on the Blizzard. So, gentlemen, we get to the match itself. The vast majority, I think, even now, even with the resources that we have at our fingertips, Harry, the vast majority of the Chile squad played in Chile. A number of them playing for Universidad de Chile, Colo-Colo, and Universidad Católica. So, even if you had the internet back then, it may have been quite difficult to find just what some of those players were made of, other than that England friendly. Zamorano, of course, was in Serie A, as we mentioned, playing for Inter, and Salas was still a slight unknown quantity playing for River. But the two of them were immediately in this World Cup. They were great to watch, and they complemented each other very, very well. Would you have a word on the manager, Nelson Acosta's Uruguayan? Sorry, I was going to say Uruguayan, but naturalised Chilean citizen in 1984. An interesting character.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, because I think he'd won league titles with Penarol as a player, but then he'd come over and he'd managed in various. But I think he'd taken over the Chile national team when he'd only managed one club side. So in a sense, he was one of those managers who seemed. He probably was best with an international team. There seemed to be some managers who it suits international football, and he was one of them because he was with the Chile team quite a long time. And I think he got them a bronze medal maybe in the Olympics in 2000 as well, didn't he? So he was there for a long time, and he did a good job. I think he seemed a sort of solid kind of chap. And of course, there was a big contrast on the touchline between him because he was bald, and then Cesare Maldini, who had that very unnaturally dark hair, didn't he? Very, very black hair that seemed it didn't really fit with his face. He had an old man's face and a young man's dark hair. And I do remember that it was pouring down with rain, and I kept looking at Maldini, thinking at some point there's going to be trickles of black dye running into his eyes, but it didn't happen. So he must have used some good products, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we should mention the Italians, Jonathan.
We should, yes.
you look at obviously, the manager's a big name in football, Cesare Maldini. You look at that side.
Oh, it's a preposterous side.
It is unbelievable. I mean,
I've got the team sheet from the game here, and you just look down it, and you look down the subs. The subs bench is a really good team, because the subs bench they had Buffon, Bergami, Inzaghi, and Del Piero on the bench. Yeah. You go, what? I
know, madness. I mean, they brought on Luigi Di Biagio, Enrico Chiesa, and Filippo Inzaghi as well. Every name in that starting 11 is a household name. You know, Pagliuca in goal, Maldini, Cannavaro, Costa, and Nesta at the back, to name a few. But Roberto Baggio and Christian Vieri were up front, Jonathan, and that's a lovely 90s kind of front pairing where you have the more sort of out and out striker and the one who kind of just off him. Shearer and Sheringham, of course, were that for England as well. And Italy were off the back of the previous World Cup of having lost in the final with Roberto Baggio missing that crucial penalty.
Yeah, but I think actually in terms of style, quite a different team. I think Maldini was much more, don't want to say old-fashioned, but he certainly didn't press in the way that Sacchi had. Mm-hmm. But I mean, still a 4-4-2. And you look at the one thing you criticise on that side is there's all the creativity is Baggio. You know, the two wide players. Would you not say
Albertini would add a bit?
Yeah, but he does it from deep, doesn't he? You know, he's not sort of. You know, I'd say he's sort of neat and tidy with the capacity to play a good through ball rather than being sort of a creator. There's Delivio and Di Matteo out wide, so they are slightly reliant on Baggio. But then and also you go Cannavaro at right back, so you're not going to get much sort of width from the fullbacks coming forward. Maldini on the other side, obviously, and it's Maldini's pass that sort of sets up the first goal after 11 minutes. So. A long ball, fantastic touch from Baggio, and Vieri runs on and slots it in. Yeah,
I mean, at that point, Harry, in the game, is an early goal from Italy. What were you thinking at the moment? You were thinking.
Well, I thought that it seemed set that Italy would win. Because they looked the Chilean team were very poor up until about the 40th minute, really, when they scored. Up until that point, they hadn't done very much at all. I think I was very excited to see Christian Vieri because I hadn't really seen much of him. And he was sort of talked about as he was going to be the sort of new, almost like the new John Charles. But I noticed in my match report, rather than comparing him with John Charles, I compare him with Billy Whitehurst.
I would back Billy Whitehurst in a fight. Put it that way.
That's what I was going to say. That I'd rather offend Christian Vieri than Billy Whitehurst. I'm hoping that Billy was complimented by that rather than the other way around. But yeah, because he had a very poor game, I thought. And Baggio is always an interesting character because the Italians seem to specialise in these sort of very creative players, but are slightly kind of fragile. Mm-hmm. It struck me that he was part of a kind of tradition of Italian playmakers who, Sandro Mazzola would be one. Giancarlo Antonioni would be another who we kind of replaced, I guess, at Fiorentina as the sort of god of Florence football. But he always looked like a sort of fragile little boy who you felt a bit sorry for. I always felt like he was forced to leave Fiorentina against his will, and it was rather like he went off to Juventus, rather like his parents had sent him off to boarding school, to prep school when he was young. He had that sort of sad look about him. And a kind of inability, I think. He could never really impose himself on a game, although he was a brilliantly talented player. So his sort of skill was a kind of fragile skill compared to, say, Zamorano, who I'd say was a very dynamic player. I always felt that with Baggio, that I always felt a little bit sorry for him, Given the fact that he's a multi-millionaire and a hugely successful footballer, the sympathy of a middle-aged man in Northumberland, I'm sure shows a huge value to him.
I'm sure he warmly receives it, though, Harry.
I'm sure he does.
But, Baggio, the previous World Cup, Jonathan, had an incredible tournament. Do you think... I realise that there's a lot of ifs and buts here, but had he have scored his penalty and Italy won the shootout, would we talk about Baggio at 94 in a similar way, the way we talk about Maradona in 86, or is that a bit too fanciful?
I'm not sure. I think because he was one of the great players of the tournament, but as I say, comparing him to Maradona brings me back to the fragility of the way that he played. Maradona dominated games, and Baggio could never dominate a game. He flitted in and out of games brilliantly, and he did brilliant things. Mm-hmm. But you never felt that was Baggio's game where he dominated. In a way, if you look back at, say, Gianni Rivera in that famous European Cup final, Milan against Ajax, Rivera just absolutely runs that game. He's one of the few players who made Cruyff look ordinary in that game. But Baggio never seemed able to do that. I don't know. Jonathan may say differently.
I absolutely agree with that. And the odd thing about '94 is that there was a time it would have been after 2 group games when it wasn't at all clear that Baggio was going to keep his place in the team. He and Sacchi did not see eye to eye at all. he wasn't Saki's type of player. Because Saki wanted this dynamism, he wanted this reliability and consistency, and you just didn't get that from Baggio. And so when they get the red card against Norway, it's Baggio who gets hooked, and that creates this huge drama. I mean, a drama with the Italian press. Who's ever seen one of them before? But I think Saki struggled to. I don't want to say struggled to accommodate him because he was clearly a brilliant player, but there was a tension there between what Saki was trying to do and what Baggio wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And it's not totally dissimilar to the tension between Bielsa and Riquelme, and Bielsa ends up just bidding off Riquelme. It's just, this doesn't work for me. So, and I guess Argentina had far more creative options than Italy did.
But I mean, Baggio scores 5 goals, was it, in the knockouts?
Because he becomes brilliant in the game against Nigeria when they're down to 10 men, where he scores twice. Baggio is stunningly good in that game, and that I think sort of nails him on for the rest of the tournament. But I don't think going into that game he would necessarily have been guaranteed to play every game.
Well, he wasn't. I can't remember. I don't think he was there at Euro '96 for Italy, and they had a poor tournament. But there he was back in the starting 11 at France '98, and just before half time, Chile equalised against Italy. And as you said, Harry, they hadn't really done much up until that point.
No, they hadn't done much at all. And then and Zamorano and Salas had done very little. And Zamorano, in fact, again, it seemed to have spent most of the game sort of diving, looking for free kicks around the edge of the penalty area. Really did nothing at all. But he got the down. I think it was his downward header. I haven't actually I thought before I did this podcast I should watch the game because I've never seen it. And then I thought, no, I'm not going to watch it. I'm going to go from my notes and stuff like that because it's that sort of sad thing of seeing something live and the way that you remember it, and then you watch it on YouTube. And it kind of distracts from it because it's not quite as you remember. Yeah. But what I remember is that Zamorano got a downward header. That's and Salas just he hit the ball into the net with this kind of incredible nonchalance, like a sort of like the way you would hit the head off a thistle with a walking stick. He just planted it into the goal with just like, oh, that's going in the net. And sometimes you see strikers who are really on form. I remember Ian Rush was like that when he was at Liverpool before he went to Juventus, where when he hit the ball, he just knew it was going in. He could turn away from it and walk off celebrating in the certainty it was in the net. And that's what Salas did, and it turned the game completely. It was almost like the way that he scored just seemed to inspire the Chilean team. And of course, they came out after half time, which I'd spent feverishly trying to get my notes in order, and scored almost immediately afterwards again through Salas. Another really good goal. And after that, they completely dominated the game. They had a guy. I mean, I just quickly look at my notes now. They had a player who I think played in Mexico. Fabian Estay, who's a sort of curly-haired midfielder who absolutely ran the game. They had a guy who I think he was a right back called Roca. Yes, Francisco Roca, yeah, and he was a sort of attacking left back who scurried along with his kind of elbows sticking out in a kind of old, remember sort of like an old Scottish winger of the sort of Ted McMinn mould. I have to compare everything to 1970s and 80s British footballs. But he was running down the wing all the time, and they were creating chance after chance, and the Italians looked completely flattened, and then you thought, oh, this is set up for a Chilean win. And, got a complete disaster because Italy would have gone into that tournament as one of the favourites, I'm sure, as you say, with the team that they had.
And that goal is a stunning goal. I mean, I think it's what Salas was great at. It's the right wing back, Bisnoel, puts in the cross, and he gets above Cannavaro. I mean, I guess the Italy defence has been dragged across. He makes a run. That's
the Gert Muller comparison that I make, because that jump.
I see it there.
Just
completely,
extraordinary. For a short guy. I know Cannavaro wasn't very tall, but still, he's Cannavaro.
And he would have been taller than Salas. I mean, Salas 5'9", I guess Cannavaro 5'10", 5'11", maybe.
I mean, they're similar height, but still, you can't take away.
And he absolutely bullets that in the top corner. It's a fantastic header.
Mm-hmm. Do you think? I mean, those 2 goals for me, watching that game, Jonathan, it was almost like Chile put themselves on the map, the footballing map. Now, I know they'd obviously, one would say, well, come on, 1962, they hosted the tournament and so on. But in the kind of modern era,
no, I think that's completely fair. I mean, I think I mean, there is a danger always with these podcasts that I just end up talking about Bielsa. However, in this instance, I think it is justified that what Bielsa did for them, even though they still didn't win a tournament under Bielsa, he gave them an identity. And I think the fact they had a naturalised Uruguayan as coach, I mean, he married a Chilean. It wasn't sort of some flag of convenience. You know, he had moved to Santiago. He was living there. It was an entirely sort of naturalisation. If that's
it was 1984 he got his citizenship in Chile. Yeah.
But still, he's grown up in Uruguay. His footballing education is Uruguayan. But there's no sort of Chilean school of football. And I think there's this sort of... You know, what Chileans talk about is that Bielsa gave them this identity and this self-belief. And that... I think the last sort of 10 minutes of this game, when they're 2-1 up, and as Harry says, dominant, and then even more so when they go into the second round, they play Brazil and get hammered 4-1.
That was a really disappointing game. Leaping ahead, because I was actually at that game at Parc des Princes, although I couldn't get in because I couldn't get a ticket because of blah, blah, blah. But I watched it, and I remember thinking that Chile had a really good chance of beating Brazil because I'd seen Brazil and they were pretty ordinary, really. And they had Junior Baiano at centre-half. You think, if you can score a goal against Nesta and Cannavaro, you can get, you can at least get 4 with Junior Baiano against you.
Yeah, and Cesare Sampaio ends up scoring twice. And it was very similar to the game against Brazil in 2010.
14.
Well, they played in 14 as well, but 2010 where they sort of capitulate.
Yes,
and I think there was this sort of lack of self-belief. And you go. I mean, I was in Chile for the Copa America in 2015, and I'm sure I've told you this story before. But they are still obsessed by Bielsa. Or they were in 2015. I'm sure it hasn't gone away. You don't get unobsessed by Bielsa, trust me. And I lost my passport, and I had to go and get a temporary replacement from the British Embassy. So go through all the bureaucracy, and they said, like, you're going to have to get two photographs done. So okay, where's the nearest place? And so if you go out the door, turn right, 100 yards down the right hand side, there's a shop there does passport photos. Just tell them you're from the British Embassy, and they'll do the right ones for you. So I go in the shop, explain in my terrible Spanish what I need, and I get taken into the back room where they do the photos. And I go in, and I'm still not really looking up, and it's dark. We haven't turned the lights on. I sit on this stool. And as the lights come on, I realise that the 3 walls facing me are all passport-sized photos of Marcelo Bielsa. it's like being John Malkovich, and except with Bielsa. And I said to the bloke, "What's this about?" Oh, Bielsa always came here for his visa photos and his passport photos. So I just thought I'd paper the walls for him because he was the man who made us believe in football.
Amazing.
And I think you really see the last 10 minutes of this game, this is before they have belief, when they have this sort of inferiority that they don't believe that they can go out and beat big sides. And then, of course, it's not till 2015 is where they win a tournament for the first time under Sampaoli, who, Bielsa disciple. 99 years after they played in their first tournament, they finally win one. But that's sort of that lack of belief I think you see in the last 5-10 minutes here as they let Italy come back at them, having had the game in their grasp.
Well, they took off one of the players that I mentioned there. Estee was taken off at about 3 minutes before. In about the 82nd minute, they made 2 substitutions in midfield because they suddenly decided they would go more defensive, which is always just like, why do that? You're doing so well, And then, of course, in the 85th minute, there's this ball to handball, is it handball incident?
It's a very modern handball, isn't it?
It's a very modern handball. And I know that after the game, the referee was a Nigerian called Lucien Bouchardot, and after the game...
He was actually from Niger, not Nigeria.
Niger, yeah. You're right, yes, I'm quite right, yes, sorry, I've written that down wrong, in my notes, just as well. I didn't mention him in my match report.
The bloke from Belgium tell you he's from Nigeria.
That's it, exactly. But afterwards, he told some journalists that he was worried that the decision was going to get him the sack and end his international career, so he obviously knew himself that it was a slightly kind of borderline decision. I have no idea. As I say, I haven't watched it again. I saw it happen and thought, and you were like, well, it seemed much of muchness. I don't know.
Well, the strange thing is that at the time I remember being outraged by it, and obviously I hadn't seen it in 22 years, so I watched it again. And now I'm actually not that bothered by it. I think it probably was a handball. That maybe just shows how our perceptions of what is handball changed. But essentially Fuentes has got his hands down by his sides as you would normally have, just sort of being balanced, jockeying Baggio on the edge of the box. And Baggio very clearly, deliberately lifts the ball into the hand.
Yeah.
But I think the hand is far enough away from the body that it is just about justifiable to give the penalty.
It's a very fortunate penalty.
But it's just. I think my outrage was the cynicism of it. That okay, you've got to be as skillful as Baggio to be able to do it, but that's not what the handball law is there for. It's not. It's not. The handball law is not there for talented players to be able to kick the ball into somebody's hand, and that's a penalty. That's not what it's about.
Yeah, which is pretty much what happens, though, of course. But it was a bit of a get out of jail free card for Italy because they weren't creating too much, and they got sort of their late penalty and they got a point. I mean, when Baggio steps up, Harry.
Well, that's the great thing in that, and in a way, that's why I picked this game as well because often now where I live, most of the people that I know are not interested in sport and actually. Like a lot of I would say like left-wing arty people of my generation, they actually abhor football and hate it. And so if you sit next to people, they'll say, "What do you do?" And I say, "Well, I write about. What do you write about? I write about football. Well, what can you possibly find to write about that? It's just 22 sweaty men and blah blah blah." And often I will tell this. They say, "Well, tell me something about football that's interesting." And I tell them about this game, and I say. Roberto Baggio, he'd missed the penalty. The last penalty that he took was in the World Cup. It was a decisive penalty in the World Cup final. He blasted it over the bar. He cost his country the World Cup. And here he was now, with the penalty. And the ground, it was a fantastic ground. That's another reason to pick it. Was the Bordeaux Parc La Scure. It's a really fantastic old Art Deco ground. It's a proper football ground. Held about 32,000 people. It's in the pouring rain. Baggio put the ball down. And then he walks back, and then he looks at the ball, and he looks at the goal, and he looks back at the ball, and the whole ground is just absolutely silent. And you realise, because you're in the press tribune with like 500 reporters from all over the world, you realise that all over the world at that moment, people are watching on TV in, Brunei and, Bhutan and Nepal and all across the world. People are sitting silently, craning forward to find out what happens. And Baggio looks at the ball, he looks at the keeper, he looks back at the ball, the referee blows his whistle, and then I will stop. And the person who's sitting next to me says, "And what happened?" You go, "Well, football's boring, you're not interested." What do you want to know? And of course, we know what happened, that Baggio scored. And so that was the fantastic thing, because if Baggio misses, the whole, the goal becomes the story of the game.
And he nearly did miss as well. I mean,
keeper got a bit of a hand on it.
Taffia got a decent hand on it. Yeah, I mean, Taffia was clearly annoyed he hadn't kept it out because he starts punching the ground.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, do you think it was one of those moments, though, where most neutrals who were probably supporting Chile because of the way the game went, you think, oh my goodness, we've sort of discovered this new side. It would be quite a cold-hearted person to have wanted Baggio to miss that kick, do you think?
Well, I wanted him to miss it.
Yeah, and you just sort of proved my point, I think, really.
No, but I know what you mean, that the redemption narrative is appealing, and I wouldn't wish on anybody the sort of reaction he probably would have got had he missed. But on the other hand, I didn't like the way he won the penalty, so there's competing karmas there.
Yeah, well, which he very much believes in, because I believe he's a Buddhist.
Well, yeah, quite right. Yeah,
he's quite right. Yeah, very good.
yeah. I have to say one thing that I may contest with your memory of the game, Harry, but of course you haven't watched this. Is for my money, I don't think it was raining when I look back at the highlights.
My memory, my actual match report says it as a day of heavy rain. That's what.
Okay, maybe the cameras don't pick up on it. It looks like it could be one of those ones.
I remember about it. I remember that it was so rainy that where we were sitting in the press, that the stand didn't cover it, and so they gave us these kind of capes that covered your laptop, that would cover your laptop, so you could type underneath this rain cape. And I was sitting near Brian Glanville, and Brian Glanville spent most of the first half. He'd found out that the linesman was from Tunisia, and he was trying to compose an obscene limerick that began, "There was a young man from Tunisia." But I don't know how far he got with it. Anyway, so I do remember it was raining heavily. I can tell you that.
Well, do you know what? Your memories from France, having not watched it, are better than mine, and I watched it just this morning. So
I have to say, I didn't notice the rain on the video, but this feels like What's it called? The Tarkovsky film where it rains inside.
It's just raining in my heart.
Solaris, yeah.
It's when you start talking about an Italian winning goal in the last minute, I think to myself, hang on a minute. There's obviously some discrepancy here. Well, so the game ends 2-2, Harry, and then what are your thoughts about these two sides and their expectations and going further into the tournament?
Well, my feeling was that I thought that Chile were a really good side that had a good chance of going further. I mean, obviously Italy did get to the quarter-final, lost to France, but as Jonathan was saying, we were talking about earlier, when they played Brazil, I thought they had a really good chance against Brazil if they attacked them. But they just came out like they were just sort of damage limitation, and I was it was really, really disappointing to see that they didn't really ever have a go. But as Jonathan said earlier, maybe that was just a lack of confidence, and maybe a feeling Brazil always had this this kind of aura that intimidated other teams. I think less so nowadays, but
Yeah, I mean, Jonathan, if Chile went through, they had 3 points, and they finished second. They drew all their games. Do you think? I mean, I suppose football and life itself has many sliding doors moments, of course. But had they have beaten Italy, that would have been a huge scalp. The team that finished in the final 4 years earlier, they've got a great starting lineup as we mentioned, and a great substitute bench as well. Do you think maybe that actually not winning that game, they still hadn't got that big, a big result against a big side in a major tournament?
Yeah, I mean, I think when they beat Spain it was their opening game, wasn't it, in 2014? I think that was a huge moment because that was. Yeah. I mean, they had looked really good in 2010 as well, I suppose. But beating Spain, beating it must have been their second game. They beat Australia, then they beat Spain. Mm-hmm. But that was sort of this seismic moment of they put Spain out, and they had beaten the defending world champions. And I think that was sort of a culmination of the process that Bielsa began of making Chile believe in itself. Whether that would have happened earlier if they'd won this game, because I think they were definitely annoyingly cautious against Brazil. I think they're a bit cautious against Austria and Cameroon as well. When you look at the strength of that side, which is the playmaker Estai and then the two centre forwards, to essentially be reactive against Austria and Cameroon, maybe wasn't getting the best out of the resources they had. So yeah, maybe if they had held on, it would have all been different. I mean, they would have had 5 points. Italy would still have had 6, but maybe they would have beaten Austria or Cameroon. Then they'd had 4 points, sorry, because it was 2 points for a win. No, it was 3 points to win, so they would have had 5 points. Mm-hmm. But maybe they'd have got a win against Austria Cameroon, then they'd have been top of the group, and they wouldn't have been playing Brazil in the last 16. So,
Well, it took a while, as you say, to get that sort of monkey off their back and not be so intimidating. Because I remember in 2014 when they were mightily close to beating Brazil, Harry, it was a shot off the crossbar in extra time and all this, and they eventually lost on penalties, of course. And people were saying that some Chilean fans, I forget who it was, who said that he was in the same hotel as them, one of the journalists, and Chilean fans walking around the hotel just going, oh, so close. And you can see that progression, can't you? And then, of course, 2015 Copa America, they win it, and they win it again the next year, beating Argentina twice in the final. And at the moment, really, I mean, okay, a side like Chile, a small population, the quality in their squad will kind of fluctuate up and down a little bit more than perhaps bigger nations. But they seem to be not really scared of anybody these days in football.
No, well, that's right. And what's been interesting to me is that's after this, one of my best friends now who lives in Hexham, where I live. He's Chilean, so so I sort of followed the fortunes of their team, and I do remember this game, as I say, with great affection. And it's funny with certain games that you're at, you form a bond with one of the teams, and I would feel that with Chile, even if I didn't know Enrique, my friend, I would feel a similar thing. I would always hope that they would do well. Mm-hmm. Because the experience of that game, I think that was sort of something that stuck with me. Particularly, I like Salas and Zamorano, but there was something about them at that World Cup that I liked. Yeah, I liked it, and their fans as well would sort of seem good. And I feel the same way about Mexico as well from that tournament.
Sorry, carry on, Harry. Sorry.
No, that's what I sort of take from that game as well. There's a sort of lasting sort of liking for Chile, I guess.
Well, and of course, George Robledo, a very important player in the history of North East football as well. From Chile.
That's right. Well, that was in my notes. Indeed, was saying on a day of rain that they would have recognised from their time. The Robledo brothers would have recognised that. I didn't use that in my match report. I thought I had enough with Billy Waiters. I thought that was probably enough.
Yeah, they're a very likeable side, Chile, aren't they, Jonathan?
Yeah, and it's I've had a great time in 2015. I went back last year. My last holiday before lockdown and all that nonsense. I mean, it's got a horrific government, but it's a wonderful country and a wonderful football team.
One of the things one of the disturbing things that my friend told me was that Javier Margas, the Frankenstein-like centre half who ended up at West Ham, that recently I said something to him about him, and he said, "Oh, that bastard!" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, don't you know he at an auction he bought Pinochet's armoured car." So he can now drive around in General Pinochet's car, which my friend was completely unimpressed by. Anyway.
Yeah, well, what a note to finish on, Harry.
Exactly.
Thierry, well, Harry, it's been a pleasure. I mean, France 98 is a tournament I remember very, very affectionately, and I'm sure many others do. And this game in particular, where I think Chile did put themselves on the footballing map in the modern era. So thank you very much indeed for joining us to discuss that one. For more stories like this, everybody do check out theblizzard.co.uk. Marvellous stuff. So, Harry, thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Jonathan, as always.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.